When people find out that I can speak Korean, one of their first responses is usually, why? And it sounds like a really simple question, but it's actually quite complicated. So today I'm going to give both the simple and the complicated answer to that question. Why did I choose to learn Korean? But before I even get into talking about my answer to that question, I kind of want to talk about the question itself. It's kind of a weird thing to ask people. Usually when people mention that they have a hobby, people don't respond with, why do you do that hobby? It's kind of just like, oh, okay, cool, that's your hobby. And I think it's because people don't view language learning as a hobby because it has the word learning in it. And so they're like, it has the word learning. Obviously it's not a hobby, you're like studying. But it's really not any different from a hobby. It's just a skill, right? And so is soccer, so is knitting. It's just a hobby that happens to also be something that you have to learn how to do well. And similarly to those other hobbies like soccer or knitting or whatever your interests are, the answer is usually because I like to do it, right? Like, you know, someone who plays soccer probably likes to play soccer, that's why they're doing it. Someone who likes to knit, you know, that's why they knit. Someone who learns a language in their free time probably likes doing it. That's the reason that they're doing it. It's not really any more complicated than that. So yeah, the simplest, shortest answer to this question is because I like it. And I feel like most people who learn languages in their free time probably are also doing it either because they like it or because they have to for some reason, like work or, I don't know, trying to get into a college in another country. You know, it's either like that external, like I have to do it to achieve X, Y, or Z, or it's just like, it's fun. That's why I'm doing it. I like it. But I feel like when people are asking me why I learn Korean, I feel like they're actually trying to ask me like, why Korean of all things? You know, there's so many other languages. How did you end up choosing Korean versus other languages? So I'm going to answer that question by kind of talking about how I became exposed to Korean as a language and then what made me kind of choose to go into that language versus other languages that were around me, such as Spanish, for example. So before I get into kind of how I figured out that Korean was my interest, I want to talk about kind of just language learning more generally. Way back in middle school, I decided that it would be super cool to be able to speak another language. I don't recall, you know, it's been many, many years since I was in middle school. I don't recall like what exactly about language learning drew my interest or what even made me think of it as a concept. I don't even think I had friends that were like from other places at the time. I don't know. I think I just decided one day that it would be cool to learn a language, and because I lived in the southern United States, I decided to try and learn Spanish because that's, I feel like, the most commonly spoken language in the US, I believe. Besides English, I feel like Spanish is often the go-to language for a lot of Americans to consider learning when they think about learning another language. Spanish is just the first one that kind of pops into their head. So my middle school didn't actually have any Spanish classes, so I decided to kind of study, try to find materials online. It was like 2008, maybe 2009 at the time, so there wasn't that much that I could find. I'm sure there's a lot more now. I'm sure there was a lot then as well, but you know, my little middle school internet searches revealed SpanishDict.com, I think, to me, and so I tried to learn some stuff on there. Anyway, that's all to say that even before Korean ever entered my life, I was really interested in the idea of possibly one day being able to speak another language. And even way back there in middle school, I didn't really think of it as like learning, like studying. It was just kind of a cool exercise to try and kind of figure out the logic of the language. I've always liked things that were kind of logic-based. I like puzzles. I like math sometimes. You know, I'm not a big math nerd, but I always liked the kind of logic of numbers going together to make things make sense, if that makes any sense. So I always kind of liked the grammar aspect as well as, you know, just learning how to be able to communicate in another language. So that was middle school, and then I moved to a new city for high school, and in that city there was a Hyundai like factory, a car making factory. And because that factory was there were a lot of Koreans in that city. And so at my high school, there were also quite a few Koreans. I went to an academic magnet high school, and because of that, I think there was quite a higher percentage of Koreans at my school in particular compared to some of the other high schools in town. But because of that, I ended up making some Korean friends in high school. And I would sit with these friends at lunch, and I believe, you know, again, very fuzzy memory, but I believe that I was the only non-Korean person who would sit with that particular group at lunch. And they would speak in English sometimes, but they would also sometimes kind of just chat amongst themselves in Korean when they would make like a comment or two to each other. And as I would hear them have these kind of side conversations or just make comments in Korean on the side, I became really interested in learning the language just because, you know, I want to understand what they're saying, you know, like it was kind of like a logical problem again for me to try and solve. So yeah, that ended up being kind of reason number one that I gained any interest in the Korean language at all, or any exposure at all, which I probably hadn't had up until that point, at least not that I realized. And again, because of those friends that I made in high school, quite a few of them were interested in K-pop, and so because they liked certain K-pop groups, I also became exposed to certain K-pop groups as well, and I began to listen to K-pop a little bit as well. It felt very just visually and like conceptually very different from a lot of the music I was listening to in America, and so I was like, wow, this is a really cool kind of thing. And at the time, it wasn't really popular. I feel like nowadays K-pop is much more widely known. Like, it's not abnormal to have like lots of people in any given school at this point that know about K-pop at least, or maybe that like BTS or whatever. But at the time, it was not nearly as well known. I think the extent that people knew about it was Psy's Gangnam Style, which had just recently come out at the time. So yeah, back in like 2010, 2011, there wasn't really anybody else, maybe like one or two other people at my high school who also had Korean friends and therefore became exposed to Korean music. So yeah, it wasn't a very common thing to be into. And then in addition to that as well, my friends also were watching some Korean shows, Korean dramas, and they were like, hey, I'm watching this, you should watch this. And so I would find like janky re-uploads to YouTube that had English subtitles at the time. Places like Drama Fever or Viki that were, you know, kind of hosted those Asian shows probably existed at the time, but I sure did not know about them, so I just used YouTube. So yeah, it was kind of a combination of all these things coming together where Korean was suddenly having a really high exposure level in my life. I was hearing it from my friends at school, I was hearing it in the music that I was getting kind of into at the time, and then I also was hearing it in these shows that I was watching and really liking. My first actual learning experience came before actually knowing about the K-pop or dramas. When I first met one of my friends, it was on a day we had like a community service kind of field trip kind of day. And while waiting for the bus, we were just sitting in the gym and I had some flashcards, and she kind of like wrote out the Korean alphabet, Hangul, on the flashcard. And I kind of, you know, learned the basics in one day while like, you know, waiting for the bus and, you know, hanging out during the day. That was the beginning of it all. I thought the alphabet was super cool. I thought that it was so like logical and kind of geometric looking, because, you know, there's like squares and circles when you first encounter it, and it seems, I don't know, really kind of cool for a logic puzzle loving person like myself. I don't think there was a moment, there might have been, but I don't remember a moment being like, you know what, I decide that I'm going to learn Korean. It was just more of a kind of a slow building thing. I learned how to read Korean one day, and, you know, as my exposure to it just continued to increase through the music and the TV shows and my friends, it was just kind of natural, you know, my language curious self would be like, oh, how do you say this in Korean? Or how do you say that in Korean? And I would learn little tiny bits and pieces here or there. And yeah, it all kind of snowballed into me kind of just having this desire to learn more Korean. Even back then, before I really knew all the work and effort and time that it would take to actually fully learn a language, I don't think that I actually believed that I ever would like become fluent in Korean or in any language. It was more of just kind of a fun hobby on the side that I wanted to learn how to speak some Korean, I think. Maybe I was, you know, kind of naive and like, yeah, sure, I'll just learn Korean, easy. But yeah, at some point later in high school, I like went to the bookstore, found like the one Korean textbook they have. I think I have it here actually. Yeah, here it is. It's really kind of janky read and speak Korean for beginners book. It has lots of romanization, which is not great, but yeah, it had kind of basic Korean stuff. And I didn't even finish it, honestly. Like, I went through parts of it, and it was kind of, you know, later in high school where I became a little bit more of kind of, you know, nerdy and kind of studying little bits and pieces on my own. I would like bike around my neighborhood and have like headphones on, like listening to the CD for that book, which by the way is dangerous. Like don't like have headphones in and ride a bike, that's dumb. But I did that in high school. And then also at this time, I first found Talk to Me in Korean and studied a few lessons on there, not too seriously. But yeah, like little bits and pieces of learning very basic stuff. That was kind of high school me, back when I had, I guess, the most kind of influences in my life inspiring me to learn Korean. When I went off to college, I didn't go to the same college as any of my Korean friends. And although I'm sure there were tons of Koreans at the school where I was at, I didn't really know any in my personal circles. So when I first started college in my freshman year, I made a pretty close friend that was my roommate, and we kind of hung out and had activities together. But during that first kind of semester, I kind of dropped Korean entirely. I wasn't really listening to much K-pop. I wasn't really watching any Korean shows. I was just hanging out with my new friend and studying like crazy, like the nerd I was at the time. Still am, honestly. But then during the second semester of college, I don't know what inspired it. I think I was just like, oh yeah, it's been a while since I, saw if there were any new music videos from any of the groups I liked or watched any Korean dramas. So I started to kind of get back into K-pop. I started watching a ton of Korean dramas, and that was the time where I was like, all right, I'm gonna get back to actually learning Korean. And I studied like crazy that semester. Like I went through a ton of Talk to Me in Korean stuff. I went through, I found vocabulary lists for like the top 1,000 most frequent words, top 2,000 most frequent words, that kind of stuff, and study them, which again, I don't really recommend. But yeah, I was just very, very passionate about Korean. Probably the most passionate and the most intense I've ever studied Korean was in that like second semester of freshman year. And kind of ever since then, it's been kind of a slow, steady thing. I haven't really dropped listening to K-pop or watching dramas for long periods of time since then. They've been a pretty constant thing in my life. I started watching variety shows in Korean. Basically all of my media is almost exclusively Korean, or at least it was at the time. Now I have more of a mix of some like Chinese and other things as well, but I don't really listen to much American music or watch almost any American media at all. It's pretty much all either Korean or some other Eastern Asian kind of content. And yeah, it was at this kind of point where rather than it just being because, I had friends around me speaking Korean or just because I had this exposure to Korean in my life, it was more that I kind of realized that I really enjoyed the Korean language itself. I still, of course, enjoyed like listening to it in songs and on TV, but I also just really enjoyed like figuring out the language, like breaking down how, structurally it's different from English and figuring out how sentences are made and using particles and all those things. So I just really kind of just fell in love with the actual language. And since then, it's kind of just been that way. A lot of things have happened related to Korean since that point in my life. I studied abroad in Korea for 6 weeks one summer before my senior year. When I went to grad school, I ended up kind of accidentally getting thrown into a whole Korean community, which did absolute wonders for my Korean speaking and listening skills. I went to Korea and worked for a year in Hagwon after that. I wrote my whole thesis relating to how learners of Korean interact with native speakers and how native speakers react to them. And, it's been a very constant thing in my life since then. So if you circle back to the original question of like, why did I end up learning Korean versus other things? In a certain sense, it was almost inevitable just because of the amount of Korean that was becoming part of my life. I was, because of all my Korean friends, I was listening to almost all Korean music. I was watching almost all Korean shows. And if you have that much Korean stuff happening in your life, and if you're also interested in languages, of course you're gonna choose Korean as the language that you'd like to learn. Even if you're not trying to learn Korean, if you have that much Korean exposure around you, you're gonna kind of pick up some things on accident anyway. My brother isn't really trying to learn Korean, but just through watching a lot of variety shows and listening to some music with me, he knows quite a few phrases and quite a few little things. Like, could he have a conversation? No, but he knows a surprising amount considering he hasn't really studied the language at all. So for someone like me who actually likes learning about languages, well, duh, of course I'm gonna actually learn it. It's a huge part of my life, now more than ever. So yeah, the long, complicated answer to that question is, well, I had a lot of friends who were Korean and all the music that I listened to was in Korean and all the shows I was watching was in Korean, and I like languages. So when you add all those things together, you get someone who learns Korean. That's not the answer that I give to people. What I say usually is just, oh, I had a lot of Korean friends in high school, so I became interested in the language, which I guess is kind of a very, very short, simplified version of that answer. More than anything though, I think I just enjoy the language. That's why I learned it, because it was fun to me. Because honestly, if you asked me about any one of those particular pieces and said, oh, did you learn because of K-pop? I'd be like, not really. I mean, I like K-pop, but that's not what spurred me to learn the language. Or, oh, did you learn Korean because of K-dramas? I mean, not really. I like K-dramas, but that's not really what spurred me to learn the language. Or, oh, did you learn Korean because of your friends? I mean, kind of. They were the starting point of it all, but I didn't learn Korean from my friends, or, I didn't actually end up using it to communicate with my friends. They were just kind of what brought Korean awareness to my life. The reason I learned Korean is because I like Korean. I like the language. It's fun to learn. With only the motivation of wanting to understand K-pop or wanting to understand K-dramas, if you don't have the love of the language, you're not going to get that far. It's just kind of the honest truth. In addition to any one of those motivations for learning Korean, you'd have to also have a love for the language itself. And more than that, you have to have a love for actually learning about the language. So yeah, that's the overly long and complicated story behind how I first became interested in Korean. If you're learning a language or languages, leave a comment saying, what kind of first drew you to that language and got you interested in learning that language. And yeah, that's all I had to say for today. So until next time, 안녕.